The pistol crack split the heat like a blade. Vultures exploded from a bleached yucca as if the sky itself had been startled, and a belt of dust unrolled across the plain, swallowing the horizon in a slow, indifferent wave. Arlen Wyatt's hands were on the wheel of the broken wagon because there was nothing else to do but hold on, but she was already listening for the thing she feared most. The footfall of men who meant to take what she had and leave her with less than the desert had always given her, only silence and sunburn. She had been mending a wheel when the first shadow rode out from the tumbleweed, 5 horsemen like a dark problem on the road. They circled with the ease of predators who had done it before, boots and stirrups, faces shaded by hat brims. The leader dismounted slow and confident and came nearer, spurs clinking like a language all the others understood. Arlen kept her jaw set. Her mouth tasted of dust and coffee and something colder, a memory of her father's hands teaching her how to shoulder a shotgun. "Just the wheel," she said, because bluntness wasted less breath. "I'm bound for Prescott. Ain't got no coin worth a man's trouble." The leader smiled, an easy, ugly thing that didn't reach his eyes. Barrack Knoll. She'd heard the name once in a stopover, a rumor like thunder on the edges of tavern talk. He had the habit of stepping into people's days and making them small. Beside him, Krill Maddox laughed and spat under his boot. Yonah Picolet hung back by his horse, his jaw working like someone who had chewed the wrong thing for too long. 2 others completed the circle, a hard-faced man with a scar along his cheek, and a younger one who looked at Arlen with a curiosity that was most dangerous when it paired with hunger. "Girl's a stubborn sort," the leader said. "Maybe stubborn enough for a joke." When the right hand of the leader reached for Arlen, the raw animal part of her bade her refuse. She pulled the worn canvas of her shuttered blanket tighter over her lap. She'd learned to hide things. She'd learned to keep small weapons where a hand always fell without thinking. The man touched the rim of her shawl with the same studied gentleness a butcher used to test a lamb. "Hands," she warned. He answered by moving closer. One of the men laughed. There was a small, cruel economy to the moment. Risk for them, humiliation for her, trade-offs meant to convince the rest of the trail that the desert had different rules. She thought of the gun her father had left her, an old coach gun with the stock smoothed by years of use. She had been taught to make it count. The leader's hand slid from the blanket to the mouth of the gun at her hip. His grin grew. "You're traveling light for a widow." Arlen's fingers found the stock under her skirt. She set her jaw, and because she could not bear the thought of giving them the pleasure of her fear, she let her voice be steady. "Move away from the wagon." A whisper of wind answered. The leader relaxed as if he'd won. He reached out to push her, an impudent, owning motion. The world tightened into the distance between his hand and her face. Then a set of tracks hit the ground, the rapid cadence of a rider who had been pushed to a gallop. A man came out of the heat like a figure drawn from a darker hour, mounted high, cloak flapping, badge under his vest if you looked close enough. He rode into the line between the men and the woman, as naturally as if he'd been standing there all along. Rook Calderon slowed his horse to a walk, taking in the scene at a glance the way a doctor looks over an injury. He had the gait of a man carrying more than his weight in grief. Shoulders square, eyes like winter ponds, the jaw set. He had been a marshal for long enough that his face did not give much away, but the thing that made him dangerous was the stillness inside him. It spoke of someone who had once been pulled by wild currents and had chosen, each day, to stand against them. "Marshal," Barrack said with the kind of respect a hungry man gives a bigger gun. "Far from Phoenix? What brings the law this way?" Rook's voice was low. "The road, the same as you men." He dismounted without ceremony. He had the look of a man who'd carried with him a loss that had not been healed by time. There was an absence he could not hide. He tucked his chin and said nothing about Elahin and Thomas, the small names he kept like stones in his pocket. He did not have to. Arlen watched him, measuring the angle of his shoulders, the way his hand hovered near his hip. She did not lower her own hand from the shotgun. Perhaps that steadied the moment as much as the marshal's presence. She smelled leather and spent tobacco on him, and something else, soap and a faint trace of leather glove that spoke of discipline, not of the dusty lawman who leaned on reputation. He looked at her the way a man looks at a broken thing and reckons whether he can fix it, for reasons she could not name, that made her blood clearer. "Back," Rook said to the leader. No one laughed. Words carry different weights when they come from a man whose voice suggests the end of things that begin badly. He moved with an economy of motion that betrayed training more than show. "You're in the wrong business, Noel. Put your hands where I can see them." Barrack considered the order as if considering a joke. He had a reputation that earned obedience in towns where sins were currency. He put his hands on his belt, slow and theatrical. The others did the same. But it wasn't obedience that mattered so much as whether any of them believed the marshal would shoot. Jonah Picolet shifted, his gaze quick and uncertain, like a boy deciding if smoke in the distance is thunder. For a moment, the line of movement held, 5 against 1 woman and 1 marshal. For a brief second, it could have gone either way. Then Barrack's hand twitched. It was a small thing, an eye roll of impatience, but it was enough. Rook moved before everyone could think. A pistol spoke, and the sound split the air with the hot clarity of a struck bell. Arlen felt it in her teeth. A horse reared and thrashed. Dust leapt into the air as the 5 men swore and spread outward, muscle and scent and threats becoming something else. Targets. Arlen's father had taught her to aim for the things that mattered. The hands, the knees of an animal, the mechanics more than the pulse. Her shotgun bellowed and the night answered with the startled cry of a man who had thought himself untouchable. She fired twice in quick succession, each blast a punctuation. A man went down behind his horse. The ground where he had been trailing churned into red and dust. Krill Maddox yelled like a beast and pulled his horse back, cursing, the audacity of the moment turning to panic in his mouth. Rook leaned into the fight like someone who had been waiting for a chance to stop running. He had the lean steadiness of a man who mistrusted the speed of his own heart but trusted his aim. He moved fast enough that the men looking to take advantage had to reconsider. He shot down Barrack's pistol hand, and Barrack's grin flickered like a candle about to gutter. The others scrambled for cover behind their horses, faces pinched with the sudden reality of being mortal. It was short, it was precise, it was ugly and necessary. 3 of the 5 lay groaning, 1 had a shoulder ruined, and the leader was caught with his gun clattering into the dust and his pride shredded. Jonah Picolet, who had been the youngest and least sure, found himself with 2 bullets left in the air and no choice but to drop his weapon. He sank to his knees as if the earth had opened for him. When the shouting stopped, the plane held its breath in its hollow way. The vultures returned, suspicious and patient, weary of human soap and clamor. Rook stood panting, pistols empty at his sides. He looked at Arlen once, and there was something, an assessment, a question, implicit in the look. Arlen held the gun in a hand not quite steady and looked back. She had fired. She'd saved herself in part with the skill her father had made sure sunk into her bones. In part with the presence of a stranger who had arrived like a solution in the midst of trouble. Rook approached the men carefully, inspecting wounds like a man who had seen too many shapes of defeat. He barked terse orders: bind them, search them, take what they have and leave the rest. The men moved under the marshal's command the way cattle follow a rope. Arlen's eyes lingered on Jonah, whose face had the look of a boy startled by the vastness of his own stupidity. "You could have stayed dead a good way from here," Rook said to Barrack as he cuffed him. He touched no sentiment. He held law like a blunt instrument. "You take folk and you pay the county for it. Phoenix'll be interested." Arlen watched him bind hands and collect names. She watched Barrack's face when the knowledge of being in a marshal's custody washed over him. Even hardened men had the capacity to pale. She felt a strange thing then. A flush of gratitude that was not quiet like a secret. It was loud and messy. It wanted to be said, but she kept her mouth shut. There were things a woman on the road learned. Gratitude delivered too quickly could be mistaken for weakness. "You're bleeding," Rook said, finally looking at her. There was a small graze on the back of her hand where a splinter from the wagon had opened and been forgotten in the rush. He didn't ask whether she was hurt more in the body or in some pocket of her that a wound did not reach. He offered a bandage with the same efficiency he used to bind hands. She let him. "Thank you," she said, because manners were the signposts the world still respected. "No deaths," Rook said, but it wasn't unkind. He looked at the line of men kneeling in the dust. "We ride to the next post. I won't leave knaves running blind." If a pause could take the place of an answer, Arlen took it. The caravan that was her life, her modest goods, the small bundle of personal things, a trunk of cloth to sell, was all she had to declare. She was on her way to Prescott to stand at her aunt's counter and learn how to be less alone. The thought of Prescott steadied her like a rope. They moved like a small procession back onto the road, the captured men bound and seated on spare horses, the broken wagon lashed with rough cords, and the marshal riding beside Arlen, both their mounts kicking up the same cloud. The sun was brittle and vengeful. There was a swing of conversation between the two of them that was quiet and clumsy like new settlers in a sod house. "I'm Rook Calderon," he told her, as if names mattered in the way they did in the law. "Arlen Wyatt," she answered. "Bound for Prescott, to my aunt's. Ita Wyatt keeps a small hat shop, and I take her goods north." "You're a long way to be hauling hats by yourself," Rook said. His voice had the edge of a man who had spent time weighing the cost of things. "It's a cold trade for the road, Miss Wyatt." "Rough business," she conceded. "But it's honest, and it keeps both hands busy." They rode to a temporary clearing where Rook ordered a watch to be set. He assigned a pair of riders to lead the captives by turns, and had Jeff Morland, the coach driver who had been passing by and had been roped into the affair, keep a tall watch. The sun starved for the horizon. Men were stripped of their swagger into the honest work of bandage and tie. When night came, they made camp in a ring of wind and dust. A small fire demanded their attention as much as the captives did. Rook took his place by the embers and, for a long moment, said nothing. Arlen put her back to the wagon and felt the wood's coarse honesty against her shoulder. The 5 men were cuffed together, heads down, dreams broken like their ribs, some muttering and some silent. Jonah Picolet sat apart from the rest. He watched the fire like a man watching his own hands. At one point, when no one was looking, he lifted his chin and met Arlen's eyes. There was a flicker, a boy who hadn't wanted to be a bandit when he thought he could be something else. Later, while the others slept in a guarded hush, he muttered a small confession to Rook while the marshal checked the bindings. "I didn't mean for it," Jonah said. His voice was a soft thing that the night wanted to steal. "We were scraping." Barrack talked big, said it'd be easy, said he'd share. Rook had listened like a man collecting evidence of human frailty. "Easier to follow than to stop," he observed. He did not judge with the kind of heat that scorches. He measured instead and found that the boy's 4 limbs were not yet made of steel. "You'll be drawn different when you stand in a courthouse, Jonah. You're going to tell the truth, and it's that truth that will buy you the one thing Barrack never could, a life without him." The boy nodded, a small, desperate shiver in his shoulders. The desert night took his words and put them away. Arlen's hands were raw with a task of their own. She repaired what she could of the wheel by the firelight, speaking in the way some people do when they work, words scattered like tools. Rook watched her, fascinated by the silence she wore while her hands moved. He had not seen a woman work a wheel with such hard, determined care. In that movement lay all the histories of those who had been forced into making things right for themselves. "Your father taught you to shoot?" he asked eventually. "My father taught me to live," Arlen said. The words were spare. They covered more than he could see. A life made up of a father who had given her the gun, a mother who had left early, a childhood of counting breaths and making room for loss. "He taught me to make a shot when it mattered." Rook's face softened, not with pity but with something like respect. He dug in his coat and, for reasons he did not immediately explain, offered her a cloth-wrapped object, something he had kept for years in the inside pocket near his heart. He unwrapped it with the care of a man who knew the weight of tokens. It was a small stone, turquoise, dulled by travel and time. It had been polished by years of being carried and turned. He had kept it for 15 years, not because it had power, but because it reminded him of a house he had once planned to keep. Elihin had laughed at small stones like that. Thomas had held it in fingers that were already too quick to grow. He did not tell her that. "Keep it," Rook said. "If the road proves unkind." Arlen took it between 2 calloused fingers and felt the coolness of it. It was a private thing, this exchange of objects. She could, if she had wanted, throw it back, make the life of gratitude vanish into the desert. Instead, she wrapped the stone in a scrap of cloth and slipped it into her satchel. Something about the gesture, 2 people, wounded and armored, choosing to trade pieces of what they had left, made the camp feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like a shelter. Night shut down the world in a neat blue edge. The watch rotated with quiet efficiency. Rook stood guard part of the next watch, and in the small hours, Arlen heard him humming under his breath, an off-key, careful thing, a tune that had once been for a house with a child's laughter. It was a human sound that cut through his usual reserve like sunlight through glass. When she allowed herself, Arlen told him more of her route. Prescott sat a week from the road they trod, a place where her Aunt Ita kept a hat shop in a street that smelled of boiled wool and hot ironing. There were faces she remembered and faces she did not. It was not home in a way that meant finish, it was a harbor. Ita's got a bad temper, she admitted, and Rook smiled like a man who knew larger storms but welcomed smaller ones. But she'll have a room and a place to lay down the trunk. Prescott's not a bad place, Rook said. You won't be alone. It was an idle promise. It was also something like a charting of future geographies, one man laying out a map without knowing if he wanted it. They did not speak of his loss. Talk in that direction would have dug up things neither had the time nor the courage to replant in the fast soil of a roadside camp. There were histories between them already, taut as spring wire. Dawn came with a slow anger, the sun rising like a reprimand. The men they had bound were watched, their injuries cleaned by the cold efficiency of the party. Rook made the arrangements. He sent word to the next postal rider where they'd be, and asked for a deputy to meet them at Seligman, that town a day's ride ahead, where they could lodge the prisoners for transfer to Phoenix. Arlen folded up the blanket and checked the wagon. She did not sleep well that night. Her mind kept folding over the shape of the man's hand at the edge of her shawl, the way Barrick's eyes had gone light at the barrel of a gun. Before they broke camp, Jonah came up to the wagon. His hands were clean but shaking. He put his face near Arlen's and spoke low so only she and Rook could hear. I wanted to say, I'm sorry for the things I did. His sentence splintered and fell apart. I didn't want it to be like that. Arlen looked at the boy and then over at Rook. There was a moment where she might have had the right to be cruel, to say the things those who survive often say to explain their luck. Instead, she found herself offering one small thing. Go tell the truth, she said. You won't be the first fool to be saved by telling it. It won't make you a saint, but it'll make you less of Barrick's shadow. Jonah's eyes watered at that, not with sentiment exactly, but with the recognition that someone had seen him as human. He nodded. Rook laid a hand on Jonah's shoulder, with a firmness that had nothing to do with punishment. You'll get a chance in Phoenix, he said, and you'll have a man who'll listen if you tell what you know. It won't fix everything, but it's better than being silent. They loaded the wagon and strapped the bandits to spare horses with the clumsy practicality of men who knew how to make do. The road ahead was long and sheeted in mirages, gullies that were more shadow than water, hills that promised green and returned dust. The travel to Seligman would be the first honest test of whether a temporary alliance could become something more durable. The captured men were the immediate need, their presence a reminder that even the best nights had the power to turn ugly again. As they rode, Rook and Arlen fell into a rhythm. He rode to the side of the wagon, and sometimes he rode behind it, as if to notice the way of her profile against the horizon. He asked a few simple questions about Prescott and her aunt, and she answered with the sort of small details that sketch a life. How Ida ironed the hat brims, how the blinds on their little room creaked at night, how the town baker kept a dog that hated strangers. You're not afraid to be on your own, Rook observed once. Arlen looked at him in the way you look at a cloud and try to discern if it will break or pass. No one told me fear was optional, she said. You learn to be friends with it. Rook's laugh was quiet. That's an honest approach. There was a cadence to the way they traveled, a tacit agreement that the road belonged to none but had demands of all. The sky burned and cooled, mountains sliding into shapes that would become familiar. They spoke little, but what they spoke lingered like breadcrumbed maps. In the evening, when they reached a low rise with a view over the town of Seligman, a small ribbon of roofs and the glint of a church cross, they saw smoke. It was a signal. A town was at hand, and with a town came deputies, a chance to file reports, to hand off the prisoners. Rook's demeanor shifted from the quiet solitude of a man to the precise professionalism of one who had a job to do. The descent into Seligman was cautious, ceremonial of sorts. Men watched them roll in with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Word had already traveled that a marshal's party was in the valley. Trade in rumors was brisk in those parts. They tied the horses at the livery and made for the sheriff's office. Sheriff Oren was a broad-shouldered man with a face that had been flattened by the responsibilities of a small town. He took the prisoners with a nod, and the exchange of papers was dry, efficient, human business. Arlen felt the town's eyes on her, as if she had been a story that had finally found an audience. People came out of shop doors and leaned on counters to stare without saying anything at all. She felt discomfort and a small growing pride. She had been the one the road would have taken apart. Instead, she had come through, shot and banded and still upright. Rook arranged for the bandits' transfer to Phoenix. He made a quiet report. He spoke with Sheriff Oren in low tones, consigning the men and ensuring that Jonah would be heard. Then he turned to Arlen and said with a bluntness that passed for gentleness, "You could ride the rest of the way with me as escort, or I can set you up with a wagoner in town who'll take you for a fair price." Arlen looked at him and saw an offer that held more than convenience. It held the possibility of a shared path. There were reasons to be cautious. A marshal was not the sort of lodger one would expect behind an aunt's counter. But there were also reasons to accept. The map of her life up to that point had been a line drawn alone. For the first time in a long while, the line forked, and someone else seemed willing to take the other branch with her. "Ride to Prescott with me," Rook said, the words halting but purposeful. "I have some business there. I can make sure you reach your aunt safe." Arlen held the decision like a coal. She could take the surety of another man on the road and keep the world measured in steps. Or she could refuse and return to the steady geometry of alone. The memory of the man's hand on her shawl flared, the feel of a marshal's steadiness. She thought of the turquoise stone in her satchel, and of a childhood that had taught her to measure risk with care. "All right," she said at last. It was not a promise made for sentiment. It was a management of the future, a pragmatic agreement dressed in the language of companionship. When Rook nodded, his eyes softened just the smallest fraction, as if she had broken something in him that he thought he would never let break again. They set out at dawn toward Prescott, with the road unspooling ahead, the horizon a promise and a threat. Behind them, the echo of the fight lay like a bruise. In front of them, a future that had begun under a sky of dust and danger was also a place where decisions could be remade. Arlen rode with the coach gun at her side, the stone in her pack a small steady cool. Rook rode slightly ahead, his figure a silhouette against the morning glare, and for the first time since he had been a man in uniform, he felt the shape of something like anticipation in his chest, thin and hesitant, but real. They did not yet know the demands that Phoenix would make, the way Barrack Knoll's face would keep returning to them in nightmares and courthouse schedules, or how Jonah's remorse would grow into a story that would color more than one testimony. They did not know whether Prescott would be a harbor or a place that would ask too much of her. They were riding into a future with hands full of small, fragile things, a stone, a gun, a promise. As the sun rose higher and the plain stretched out, the road took them into a quiet that felt like a held breath. The desert was wide, and in that wideness the two riders in the wagon seemed small and improbable. Yet they moved steadily forward, and that steadiness was, in itself, a kind of answer. They rode the last stretch into Prescott, under a sky that had lost its noon hardness and softened toward a forgiving blue. The town sat tucked against low hills like a hand cupped against the wind, a place of wooden porches and chimneys that promised heat and a running story in every shop window. Men paused to look, children skittered behind counters. Ida Wyatt's hat shop smelled of starch and worked wool, its windows bright with pinned brims. When Arlen and Rook turned into the street, the noise of the road folded into the bustle of a small town that knew its own rhythms and measured strangers by how long they planned to stay. Ida met them at the door with a glare that had the warmth of someone who disguised affection behind a steely eye. She took in the wagon, the bandaged hand, and then Rook with the sharp assessment of a woman who had kept a household through more storms than she cared to count. "Good God, child," she said, the words clipping but not unkind. She crossed the threshold and put a hand to Arlen's cheek as if to make sure the woman beneath the dust was flesh. "You look like you've been dragged through a fence, but you're whole enough." "Arrived, Aunt Ita," Arlen said. Her voice had lost none of the reserve that had served her well along the road. She kissed the older woman's cheek, a stiff, honest motion. Behind them Rook tipped a hat in a loose, courteous arc. Ida's shop became a harbor in the way small places become havens, a room to set a trunk, a hearth that would make clothes smell less like trail dust, and a bowl of stew that tasted of broth and apology. Lorna Kestrel, who ran the boarding house across the street and kept her own ledger of other people's troubles, pressed a plate into Arlen's hands as if bread could stitch up the small fissures the road had left. "You'll tell me everything," Ita said after the first bowl, not a demand but an inevitability. Arlen told as much as she needed to, enough to lay the facts clean. The wheel, the 5 men, Barrack Knoll, the shot, Rook's appearance. She left out the way her hands trembled after she fired, and she left out the nights when she had dreamed of hands at her waist as something to be feared. But she did not hide the fact that she had been forced to choose how to survive, and that, for all her stubbornness, she had been grateful. People in Prescott heard of courage the way they heard of storms, something talked about at porches, then folded into evening conversation. The news of the marshal's capture of the gang made its way to the post office, and then to the small square where men drank bad coffee and argued the state of cattle prices. Sheriff Oren, when Rook sent word of his intention to hand off the prisoners to Phoenix, did what Towns did. He offered his courthouse, his clerk, and an arrangement that would make the long trip east more bearable. Fenric Dowse, the blacksmith whose forge was a permanent heat in the center of town, saw to the wheel with the practical patience of a man who understood metal and the stubborn virtues of good work. He patted the rim as if salving an animal. "Wheel's bad," Fenric said with the bluntness of someone who measured repair by sparks. "But it's fixable. Come by in the morn. I'll set it right." Rook remained in public a man who balanced questions with facts. He checked the bindings on the prisoners, coordinated with Sheriff Oren, and made certain that any evidence the men had would be carefully logged. Where others saw him as simply the law, he carried with him a steadiness that made townsfolk relax into the thought that some order still remained, even at a time when law often felt more like a rumor than a presence. That night, Prescott gathered not to announce a hero, but to welcome 2 people who might become part of its map. Lorna's boarding house fed them again. A pair of children, her niece and a neighbor boy, pressing their faces to a doorway, listened to scraps of the story as if it were a fairy tale in which the outcome had been certain all along. Arlen went to bed with a weariness the road did not cure, though the small comforts of a proper bed and hot water worked like small antibodies against the long exposure of travel. The next morning Fenric had the wheel down and a steady rhythm at his forge. He worked with hands that had the deliberate cruelty of someone who had seen countless wagon wheels come to him like people with their heads bowed. Rook stood by while Arlen watched, and in a pocket of silence he returned the turquoise stone he had given her the night before. It lay warmed by the inside of his coat, dull but familiar. "Take care of it," he said, "and of yourself." She tucked it away with the practical solemnity of someone who understood tokens were not talismans, but reminders. Fenric whistled under his breath as he beat a rim into shape and spoke of roads and their demands. "You done right to be on the wagon," he told Arlen. "Running goods keeps you fed. Watch the men who offer you more than a courtesy." Arlen nodded. There was a small knowing audience in the form of townspeople who leaned on the blacksmith's fence. Their faces held a mixture of curiosity and the comfortable fact of a community watching one of its own arrive. Rook, too, found errands of his own in Prescott. There are papers a marshal must file, accounts to be made neat, and a post to be set into motion for the prisoner's transfer. Yet the man also noticed smaller things. A boy in Fenric's yard trying to mend a broken toy horse, a widow who sold bread with an air of quiet challenge. He moved through the town with a certain economy, measuring its rhythms while he kept his eye toward the horizon beyond. There were times his expression would harden, a memory behind it like frost on glass. He had a reputation for doing his job with a solemnity that suggested law was a kind of penance. When the moment came for the prisoners to be moved to Phoenix, it was the work of a day. Deputies arrived on a dry-wheeled cart. The men were led out of town under eyes that did not forget. Jonah Picolet looked plain and raw, his face marked by the decision he'd made on the plane, to drop his weapon and later tell the truth. He approached Arlen before the wagon left. "Thank you," he said, not in a way that made her feel grateful, but in a way that made him feel human. "For telling me to do the right thing. I don't know if it means much, but I mean it." Arlen looked at him as someone looks at a plant after rain, an expectation that time would make the rest grow. "Tell the truth in Phoenix," she said. "Own what you did. It won't make everything right, but it's a start. Jonah squeezed the words like a small, clumsy prayer, and then the procession moved on. Rook's parting to Prescott was not permanent. He told Ida he had business heading through there again, that the road required a hand. This was as close to asking as his reserve allowed. Ida pronounced her judgment in the way she judged things, with a sniff that was more likely to be acceptance than refusal. "Don't drag the man into your kitchen unless he's willing to sweep," she said, "and if he can't make himself useful, I'll throw him out by the ears." It was the sort of blessing that sounded like an accusation, but would, in time, prove to be a kind of love. Arlen smiled. The road had taught her to translate such things into language she could live with. They planned the ride to Phoenix together, not as two people falling into a script, but as two people with a purpose, the law, the town's safety, and a boy's testimony to be heard. The ride would take them across plains that had grown more familiar now that they had shared danger. Between them the conversation had begun to loosen, revealing the small raw edges each bore. Rook shared stories in fragments, the feel of a house that had once been home, the sound of a child's boots on floorboards, and Arlen offered tales of Ida's stubborn kindness and small tricks she used to straighten a hat brim. The road to Phoenix was longer than either liked. It took them through a landscape that seemed by turns to test their resolve with heat, and then to promise reprieve with a cool sudden dawn. Along the way, they encountered a crooked arroyo, where a span of the trail had been eaten away by runoff, a group of cattle drivers who offered a note of courtesy and a pot of stew, and at one point, a narrow pass that forced them to ride single file. They slept under a sky that shone like an upside-down ocean, and Rook, in private watches, would look at Arlen and keep silent, not because he had nothing to say but because his reserve had teeth he could not always swallow. In Phoenix, the courthouse crouched in the small civic square the way a stern parent does at the center of a town. It was built of sandstone and the steps were worn by years of boots. There was a crowd the day the trial began, a mixture of curiosity, appetite for drama, and a civic hunger for justice that the frontier fed upon like timber. Barrick Knoll arrived with a scowl that may have been practiced. His gang, the parts of it that were left, had been secured or scattered. He sat with the arrogance of a man expecting the law to be a long-winded warning, not a binding verdict. Knoll's defense was the kind of bluster that relied on fear to fill gaps in facts. He threatened, he mocked, he tried to turn the courtroom into a stage for his reputation. Arlen's testimony in Phoenix was not made of flourishes. She spoke plainly. The road, the wheel, the men, the way Barrick had reached for her. She did not dramatize. She stated what she had seen and what she had felt. The prosecutor guided her with gentle precision. The defense tried to trip her into contradictions. It did not work. The boy Jonah, when it was his turn, told the story the way a man tells his confession in a church, with shaking hands and a voice that found a steady place in the telling. He admitted to following orders. He admitted the wrongness of it. He owned the shame without seeking absolution from the court. His words landed in the public like pebbles in a pool, and each ripple made it easier for others to be honest. Rook watched from the back with eyes that measured both the room and the faces he loved. There were times during testimony when his jaw tightened as though he could not breathe until the facts were complete and the law could do its work. Other times he would allow himself a steadier breath, believing in the process he had chosen to serve. When the defense sought to paint Arlen as an unreliable witness, someone who might have reasons to bend facts, Rook's presence felt like a rebuttal in itself. The marshal at the edge of the gallery, who had seen the bandits taken and had faith in the work they had done. Barrick's fate did not come from a spectacle, but from the accumulation of evidence and testimony. The jury, an assembly of men chosen not for cruelty, but for the slow accrual of civil custom, found him guilty. The sentence was long. He would spend years in a penitentiary whose name was a hammer on a town's conscience. Justice, in that time and place, rarely offered the neatness of absolute closure. It offered a structure by which wrongs were recognized and consequences assigned. That the law did its work lifted from the trial not a sense of triumph, but a sense of relief, practical, quiet, and battered. After the verdict, as the town calmed, people sought out Rook and Arlen. In a modest ceremony at the county office, a matter of signatures and witnesses, Jonah spoke to Rook. "I don't know how to say thank you," he said, "but I'll try to make it right. I'll work." Rook's hand on the boy's shoulder was not sentimentality. It was a passage, a marshal to a citizen, a man who could see that repair took time and work. "Do it for the one thing that can't be taken from you," he said. "Make yourself steady." When they returned to Prescott, the town gave them a quieter kind of welcome. Not hero worship, but the steady hospitality of people who had seen hard things and wanted to lift one another. There were lunches at Lorna's boarding house, where talk wandered from matters of price to matters of heart. Rook began to be seen more often than not walking the town, making small repairs here and there, helping Fenric haul a barrow, discussing with Ita what might improve the hat shop window for spring. It was in those small acts that affection budded. Rook's admiration for Arlen grew not like a sudden bloom, but like a careful garden. He noticed the calluses on her palms, watched the way she arranged brims in the shop window as if each hat had a place in the world, and he heard her laugh, rare, mostly contained, but when it came, honest and bright. Arlen, who had learned to be wary of soft words and quick gratitudes, found herself grateful for a man whose offerings were deeds. He returned tools left at Ita's, swept the shop step in the morning without being asked, and once, when a particularly nasty storm threatened a newly drilled display, stayed until midnight to brace it. They began to meet in times small and unannounced, a shared cup of coffee in the morning sun, a walk by the river where the reeds whispered secrets, the exchange of a scarf or a patch. Rook, who had once thought that home lay in the graves of the past, felt the idea of building something steadier take root in him. He would find his eyes following Arlen as she moved with tacit certainty through tasks. He would see her in the quiet corner of his thoughts and find himself planning small things. A fence, a garden bed, for a life he had not intended to imagine. Their courtship was not a single event, but a long series of small insistences. On one evening, after a meal at Lorna's where the town had gathered to celebrate the capture and trial's outcome, Rook walked Arlen part of the way home. The sky was a bruise of purple, and the light from the shop spilled warmth onto the street. He stopped at the edge of the lane and reached into his pocket with the awkwardness of a man who had never been asked to articulate anything as personal as an intention. He began and then stopped. He looked at her with an expression that was as much a question as a promise. "Come see the place I think of." It was a promise to show her something not yet built, a piece of land he had been thinking to claim, a stretch of soil with enough water and a slope that would make for decent fields and shelter. It was practical and tender both. "Show me," Arlen said, "only if you can make it worth the travel." They rode the next afternoon to the land he had in mind, a parcel with a spring at the edge and a stand of cottonwoods that would keep the house from the worst of summer. Rook walked the edge of the property like a man whom maps had failed. He pointed to where a well might be sunk, where a barn could sit, the shape of a house that could hold voices and shoes and small chairs. Arlen imagined a life of oiled wood and small hands, and the image that rose was so unexpected it almost startled her into speech. "In time," she said, "it could be good soil." Rook laughed softly. "I think it already is." Their decision to marry was not a single dramatic declaration. It grew out of these long, steady things, the tending of a farm, the watching of storms, the arrival of neighbors who needed help, and neighbors who returned favors. One evening, after a long day hauling posts and marking out a fence line, Rook found himself standing at the center of the land with the turquoise stone in his hand. He had kept another small thing for himself all these years, a ring made of worked silver that had once been intended for a woman who would never wear it. He had carried it in a pocket as if it were ballast. "Will you?" he started, and his voice found a calm he had not used in the years of law and loss. "Will you marry me, Arlen Wyatt? Not because it's the end of anything, but because I think this place can be a beginning for both of us." Arlen looked at the ring, at the land, at the way the cottonwoods bent in a wind that smelled of clean soil. She thought of her father, of the gun he had taught her to use, of the small ways she had learned to survive. She thought of Rook's face when he had watched her repair the wheel, the way he'd given the turquoise-like trust. Tears came without drama, just enough to make her eyes bright. "Yes," she said. It was a simple, iron-shore answer, the kind she would make often in the years to come. Their wedding was a town affair, modest and full of neighbors. Ita fixed Arlen's hair in a way that made it look like it was meant to hold curl and dignity both. Fenric carried a spool of wire to make a frame for a small arch. Lorna baked cakes that tasted faintly of spice and hope. Rook wore his best coat, which fitted like a confession. They married on a day when the light was steady and the wind courteous, and in front of a small collection of faces they pledged themselves to the work of building and keeping. There was no grand sermon. There were words that mattered, vows not of perfection but of labor and patience. Years unfolded in the kind of slow, steady work that heals and hardens in equal measure. The farm they built together was less a monument than a set of promises kept. They raised a house with rooms that echoed and creaked. They planted rows of corn and beans and a small orchard that promised apples for pies. Arlen kept the hat shop in town part-time for a season, and it paid for nails and hinges. Rook took on the careful, respectable work of a man who could mend fences and serve as a deputy when the county needed him. Fenric helped forge hinges for the barn doors and taught Arlen to set a stone into mortar for a hearth that would keep a child's feet warm. They had children, 2 in the span of a few short years, who ran like weather through the house and the fields. The first, a boy with Rook's steady jaw and Arlen's fierce eyes, learned early how to sit with a hammer and respect the weight of a thing. The second, a girl with inquisitive hands and a laugh that filled rooms, learned how to plait a hat band and dream of places beyond the cottonwoods. The turquoise stone found its way into a small cradle, then into a shelf of keepsakes. Rook kept his badge folded into a drawer where it made the sound of a life that had shifted. Time, in its soft insistence, smoothed some edges and made others sharper. There were seasons of illness where a fever would come and make a household hold its breath, and seasons of bounty where crops glowed in sunlight and the barn brimmed with grain. There were moments where old pains would return for a day, Rook standing too long by an open field, seeing an absence that would not be healed, or Arlen waking in the night with a sharp memory of the road. But the work of each day, the picking up, the repairing, the mending, acted like a balm. People at the market spoke of the Wyatt Calderon household as a place that kept its doors open, and children in Prescott learned the names of Rook's kids as if they had always belonged. Jonah found a different life. Guided by Fenric and, in time, by a job on the ranch, he learned how to steady his hands and to reckon the value of honest labor. He married a woman from a neighboring town and came to work on the Calderon fields, a living proof that a life turned away from danger could become useful in a community. Barrack Knoll's name grew quieter in the years. The law's sentence kept him from the roads, and the town's gossip treated him like a cautionary tale. In small private ways, the outcome of those early days echoed. A boy given truth found steadiness. A leader stripped of power found obscurity. Rook, who had once been a man moved by duty and by loss, found his purpose extend beyond his badge. He taught his son the right way to carry a rope and how to listen when an animal was afraid. He taught his daughter how to tie a knot properly and how to read the weather in the way cottonwoods bent. He still rode when duty called, but more often he rode with Arlen, moving fences, checking wells, or simply sitting in a shelter of grass and sharing shade. Their marriage did not erase history. There were times when Arlen, returning from a trip into town, would pause to look at the plain and remember the man who had reached for her. Those memories were not bitterness but a part of the ledger, things that had been accounted for. In private, Rook would sometimes take out the turquoise stone and polish it with his thumb, and when Arlen asked about the years directly after his wife's death, he would answer in fragments, less about sorrow, more about the work it had taken to stand again. They grew older together in the quiet way that two people who share bricks, meals, and sorrow tend to age, not always smoothly, sometimes with sharp small aches, but with a companionship that made the long road feel less a solitary thing and more a shared path. The farm bore years of harvest and years of challenge. Children grew into productive workers and then into parents themselves. Arlen kept the hat shop in town as a small solace, something of a tether to the pace of a place where news traveled over counters. Etta aged with the kind of ferocity that made her voice shorter, but her affection deeper. Lorna's boarding house stayed the same in its essential way, a place of refuge for travelers and an indifferent repository for the town's gossip. Decades later, when the cottonwoods were taller and the porch boards of their house had acquired the patina of a lived life, Arlen would sit on the step and watch the sun lay itself across the fields. Rook would come out with a cup of coffee and sit beside her without announcement. They would not speak at first, The silence would be like the weather, a companion. When they did speak, it was about small things, a broken wheel, a child's plans, the next season's planting. "Do you remember the day on the plain?" Arlen asked once, not as a plea but as an inventory. Rook took his cup to his mouth and let the steam lift. He looked at her, and for a moment the years fell like leaves. "I remember the way you held that gun," he said, "and the way you kept your hand still after." She smiled, a slow, patient thing. "You came like a badge in the sun, Rook. You could have been anything." He held out his hand and tapped the turquoise in his pocket, the remnant of a story that had started in dust and fear and had found its way to a house with a porch swing. "We built a life from a few pieces," he said, "not because someone promised us anything, but because we did the work." They would be seen in town still from time to time, Rook with streaks of gray at his temples, Arlen with new lines at the corners of her eyes. Children of the town would run to them, knowing they could expect laughter or a firm hand. The farmhouse carried signs of a life tended, toys mended, a fence that had been rebuilt more than once, a garden that had fed more than one table. Visitors who came to sit on the porch remarked at how an accident of the road had become the axis of a household that kept its doors open. Providence, some called it, in the way the frontier had its own language for luck and choice combined. Arlen would nod, but politely deny any miraculous claim. She credited hard work, neighbors who helped, and a man who had taught her it was reasonable to keep gardens and children, and to hold on when grief returned. In the quiet years, the turquoise sat on a shelf in their parlor, surrounded by other small things. Letters with smudged ink from old friends, a child's first pair of leather boots, a photograph faded at the edges. It was not a relic of magic, but a map of memory, a token that kept time from erasing the small ways two people had chosen one another. When Rook's hair had gone mostly silver, and the gait that once tightened under grief had softened into the comfortable weight of a man who had long since made his peace with both duty and delight, the county offered him a post he could accept without violence to his new life. He declined most of it, choosing instead to be an occasional deputy and a frequent farmer. He had traded the certainty of chasing men for the steadier certainty of fixing fences and listening to the ways children laughed. He liked the regularity of tending, the way a repaired wheel returned to the road and did not ask to be remade. There were moments, even in the fullness of the years, that called up the original night on the plain. A new band of thieves, different men, different times, ran afoul of the law in a neighboring county, and the memory of Barrack Knoll's threat would ripple through the community as a cautionary tale. Jonah's children would tell the story of a boy who chose the long road of truth instead of easy criminality. These tales took on the warm tint of the pastoral. They were warnings that also taught. In their final decades, Arlen and Rook would sometimes sit on the porch at dusk and listen to the subtle music of a life well kept, the hum of crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the soft creak of a swing. Neighbors who had once been strangers walked by with a wave. Children who had been young on their porch now brought grandchildren, and the house bore the proof of that. A population of memories rather than a vault of regret. When Rook reached an age where he moved with slower certainty, he would still take Arlen's hand as though their marriage had been a daily vow, and she would feel in that small touch the same steadiness that had saved her on the plain. She would sometimes reach into the drawer and take out the polished piece of silver he had once planned for another life and place it on his palm. He would look at it and then at her and say with a modest pride, "We did right by each other." There was a long simplicity to the end of things for them. No sudden dramas, no public reckonings beyond the ordinary salutations given to those who had served and worked. They were buried, years apart, as life arranged the order, near the cottonwoods they had planted, their stones marked not by heroism, but by dates and a small inscription, together in life, in work, in keeping. People in Prescott still spoke their names in a way that folded the town's story into their own. A chapter that had begun in dust and danger, and had become, over the patient labor of years, a place where children could grow, and where neighbors found a table set on a Sunday. The turquoise, polished and private, remained on the shelf long after hands that had once held it had ceased to carry burdens. It was a little blue thing in a house full of hard work, an ordinary jewel in a life made by choices rather than miracles. The memory of the plain lived in the rhythm of the farm, the way a sudden noise made Arlen's hands go toward a tool, the way Rook's eyes measured a horizon. But mostly it lived in the quieter proofs: a fence that stood, a child who learned to tell the truth, a boy redeemed by work, a town that learned to keep one another. If you love this journey from danger to home, subscribe and share. Your support keeps these stories alive. May this story remind you that courage does not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in a steady hand, a bandaged palm, and a choice to keep building when the road looks most unsure.